How's it going?
Long time no see.
Yeah, I was telling John earlier, I was like, I don't think we've talked since he suspended me in 7th grade. I was really embarrassed. I was really nervous. I swear I stay out of trouble now.
Oh, now? Right.
Mostly.
You stayed out of trouble then too.
I'm pretty, I think for the most part,
Oh, no.
my life has calmed down since.
Has it?
Yeah, since the 7th grade, a little bit.
From Alaska Teen Media Institute, this is Podcast in Place, Youth Stories from Quarantine, a series about youth in Alaska during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're bringing you stories, interviews, and audio diaries from teenagers and young adults stuck indoors without anything else to do. I'm ATMI producer Kendrick Whiteman, recording this on a Yeti stereo microphone in my dad's apartment since the main ATMI studio was closed for the time being. The fall semester is right around the corner, and with the coronavirus still spreading throughout the world, people are wondering if schools are going to reopen, and if so, how are they going to do it safely? So ATMI senior producer Quinn White called up Joe Zawodny, a director for the Anchorage School District, to talk about their plans for reopening schools and keeping students and teachers safe. This interview was recorded remotely on July 16, 2020.
So can you tell me how your job has changed since the coronavirus pandemic started?
Sure. Obviously, it's changed a lot because now there are just a number of issues and potential issues that are out there that we're having to plan for. And so in a typical year right now, I would be meeting with principals and talking about what classes they're going to be offering, maybe what types of staffing changes they might have. We'd be working on registration processes. And now the work is figuring out how are we going to offer content that's appropriate for students, that's good for students, but balancing between at home and at school, knowing that from week to week even, we may be asking students to change where they're learning, and so that's been the majority of the work, is planning for the contingencies and the logistics for anything that might happen in our community.
Absolutely. So can you tell me about when you first realized that coronavirus was going to impact our daily lives?
Professionally, when we first realized that we were going to have to start changing some things was just before spring break last school year, when we started having to cancel school trips. As you know, we have a lot of student groups that go out of state over spring break, go out of country over spring break, and we started having to cancel those trips because our fear was that students and families and teachers were going to be trapped, in another city or even another country and not able to come back. And so it was a very difficult time. It really prepared us, though, for understanding just how much of an impact COVID, the pandemic, might have on our families, because as you know, families and students and teachers, they really look forward to those trips, and it was really difficult for the district to cancel those. Compounded with when we were initially canceling those trips, at the time, a lot of the companies weren't willing to give refunds and support families. Now, once those companies, I think, saw that was going to be a nationwide sort of cancellation,
Mm-hmm.
they started really working with families again and making refunds or deferring trips to this year, just in case they might be able to do that. So that was really when we saw that the COVID pandemic is going to have really strong impact on our families, and that we were going to have to make some really difficult decisions that we knew were not going to be popular, but we really have to think about student safety in these decisions, and what's safe for kids isn't always popular.
Absolutely. Can you talk about how ASD came to the decision to switch to online schooling this spring, and what factors were taken into consideration and what that transition was like?
Sure. So, as families were starting to come back and we were getting ready to come back from spring break, we realized that it was going to be very difficult to contain the pandemic and to provide a safe learning atmosphere. So what we didn't want to do was rush students back to school and then have to turn around and send them home, right? 1 or 2 days later. And in fact, some of our initial planning was to have kids come back right after spring break and then, to gather items and things of that nature. Once we realized that it was in our community and that it was potentially going to be coming into our schools, we decided early on we were just going to have to cancel school after spring break. And so, of course, we want to continue the academics that students had started for the school year. A lot of classes, they're doing work before spring break that they're going to continue after, especially at the high school level, we have semester-long classes. So we want to make sure that content continued on. So the decisions that were made last spring were decisions that had to be made quickly because we didn't have the summer, for instance, to plan out how this might work. So that's why, at the high school level, we created Canvas courses right away that were kind of predetermined. At middle school, we used Apex because it was predetermined courses that we could find out where students generally were by grade level and have them continue from there. Mm-hmm. We knew it wasn't necessarily the ideal academic support, but it was by far the best we could do. And we actually saw good gains. We saw good participation from students. It was a big transition, as you might imagine, for everyone, students, families, and teachers alike, because not a lot of our teachers are used to teaching in an online environment, and it's a much different environment. You're having to anticipate for needs that students have that you haven't had to think about before. Absolutely. You're really having to, what engagement looks like in an online environment is much different than what it looks like in a classroom. And it's much more difficult, as when you're communicating through email and through text and things of that nature, it's just difficult if you don't have that face-to-face. As we were talking about earlier, this coming school year, our concern is if we have to move to an online learning environment and students don't even know their teachers yet, that's going to be a real challenge. And that's why this school year, we're starting the school year in school so we can at least give students 2 or 3 weeks, hopefully with their teachers, before we have to maybe make the decision to be at home, but at least they'll know their teachers. They will have met them. We will have anticipated some of the needs that students have, really be able to track with where they are academically to make sure they're in appropriate classes. Mm-hmm. Last spring, a lot of the success that we saw came from the fact that students already knew their teachers. They knew their peers. They knew what those expectations were as far as what teachers wanted from work. Students knew their teachers' personalities. I mean, that's a huge piece of it, and they know how much their teachers care about them. So a lot of that trust building and relational capacity that happens in a classroom was already in place last year. We're having to figure out how to get, how to front load that this year. So the first 2.5 weeks of school this year really are going to be providing teachers and students opportunities to get to know each other, to make sure that all the support students need to be successful in the classroom, either in person or online, that those things are in place so that we can hopefully move forward successfully.
What is ASD's reopening plan this fall, and what precaution is the Anchorage School District putting in place to ensure the safety of students and staff?
That's a good question. So we have multiple scenarios for schooling this year that are dependent on the rate of COVID spread across our community. And so the school district is partnering with the Department of Health and Social Services, with the state of Alaska, with the Department of Education, really to determine what does COVID spread look like in Anchorage, in the municipality. And based on that, the number of infections and whether we're seeing an increase or a decrease, that will to some extent determine what school looks like for students. And what the cohort model is we're going to take all of our students, and based on, by and large, based on their last name, they will be in either cohort 1 or 2, cohort A or B. And so maybe students A through L might be in cohort 1 and M through Z be in cohort 2. And depending on the day of the week, different cohorts will be at school. The idea there being that students will have fewer students in school, thus have fewer chances of exposure and interaction. We can have fewer students in the classroom, so we can try to maintain that 6-foot social distancing that we know is important. One of the challenges this year, of course, is going to be wearing masks, really ensuring hand sanitization and hand washing. Some of the challenges and things we're thinking about is, how do you have lunch? How do you have recess? There's all these things that, these opportunities for students to interact that we know are important, but how do you do that in a safe way? And how do we as a school district ensure families that we're really looking out for their kids? All students in middle and high school are going to be taking 3 courses every quarter, but they're going to be receiving twice as much instruction in each. So they're essentially going to be moving through a semester's worth of content in 1 quarter.
Okay.
That makes sense. So what we found last year at middle school, for instance, students take 7 classes. At high school, students take 6 classes traditionally. And it was very difficult for most students to navigate 6 or 7 classes at a time. And a lot of the feedback we got was from a district perspective, from families and from students, was, I'm struggling at school because there's too much. I'm moving in too many directions at once. So by decreasing the course load for students, by making sure they only have 3 courses, we can get the same amount of content done throughout a school year, but they're only really focusing on 3 classes at a time. So if you're a student at West High School this year, then you're going to be taking 2 core classes and 1 elective class. And each of those classes are going to be 90 minutes. There's going to be a lunch. We're working through the plans for sports and activities. But again, some of those things that we really look forward to in school, some of those things might not be able to happen because we can't ensure safe distance between students at, say, dances, right? Or during assemblies and things like that, where we can only have so many people in an area at a time.
What are some of the concerns you've heard about reopening our schools?
Well, our main concern, as I mentioned earlier, really is student safety. We want to make sure that students and staff are safe. We know that even in what we consider a normal year, if students and staff don't feel safe, they can't learn, they can't teach, things don't run as effectively. So the decisions, the driving factor for all of the decisions that we've been making is around student safety. We know that some students have been wearing masks all summer. They're used to that. It's part of what they do now. We know that some students maybe are inconsistent with that, and some students haven't been doing that at all. And so just trying to create some of those habits and those safe practices around school is going to be a huge focus. So that's the number 1 challenge. When you move past that and you can help ensure a safe environment, then the challenge is, how do you, now that we're only teaching 3 classes a day, students are only in 3 classes a day, it's difficult to take math for 90 minutes for a lot of students. It's difficult to be in a language arts class or Spanish class for 90 minutes. So one of the challenges that students and teachers, I think, this year are going to have is just shifting what they're used to, as far as how long a class lasts, what should be included in a class. When you're talking about a 90-minute period, you really want to spend a lot of time on engagement, right? Making sure students are interacting, and how can you, again, do that safely and make sure that everyone, has the distance that they need to do it, still having those positive social interactions.
It must be really difficult for school administration right now. So how is ASD staff working on addressing all these concerns?
So our administrators, our principals, our registrars and folks in the building that do a lot of the work behind the scenes, they're just getting back now. And so right now what we're trying to do is solve these problems with their help, because we know that each school is a little different. The population's a little different, the needs are a little different. And while we, from a district perspective, we know there's some pieces that have to be in place, we also want, what a school looks like and feels like to be unique, right? And so we're trying to give guidance, but at the same time, let administrators and let the staff drive some of that work so that, again, like West High feels like West High, right? It's important to us that every school's culture is able to move forward as it normally would. We're trying to make as normal a year as possible, but we know that what normal is has really shifted for us as a community.
There's a lot of conflicting information coming from health experts and politicians about reopening school this fall. So how does all of this information influence ASD's reopening plan?
You're right. We have from the federal government level down to the city and municipality level, we have different expectations and different information coming at us. We're trying to balance everything as best as we can, right? I mean, districts have been threatened with, not receiving federal funding for certain things if they don't open schools, for instance. That's been talked about, and so. I know our superintendent and our school board spend a lot of time looking at those federal and state mandates and try to balance, how can we fulfill those often contradictory requirements with what we know our students need. And so there's a lot of nuance to those decision-making processes. And I think what makes our district really strong is we have really opened up our decision-making and included teachers and parents and students and community members in these decisions so that, we talk about silos, right? And we're not in one silo and the community's in another. We're really trying to take all perspectives into consideration. And we know because of the value, we really value the diversity that Anchorage brings to our schools. And we want to be able to harness the various needs and perspectives that we have in Anchorage. And so I think the district's been doing a good job of that. And moving forward, that is the plan, is to continue to involve as many stakeholders in those decisions as possible.
I came across this article on CNN earlier today about how some teachers across the country are doing things like preparing wills for school starts. And I want to ask you, how are teachers in our community feeling about reopening?
I've read a lot of research about that same topic. I think one of the statistics I saw back in May was that, upwards of almost 20% of teachers, at least in May, had indicated in different surveys that they may not be going back to work because of their fear of contracting COVID in the workplace. I think, like any emergency like we find ourselves in, we have some teachers that are very nervous about coming back and may have health reasons and other factors that are driving that. And we have some teachers that are prepared to maybe take the anxiety they have and the fear of that and put it aside because they know that having kids back in school is the best thing. And I think we are, as a district, we're poised to hopefully provide an appropriate work environment for all staff, knowing that some are okay to come back, some don't want to. In addition to our in-school environment, we're offering online content for all students as well. So if you don't feel like coming to school because you or your family are nervous about being at West High School, for instance, there will be teachers at West High School that are in charge of our virtual school that's attached to each neighborhood school. So you can learn online and stay attached to your school at the same time until you feel safe to come back. So there will be opportunities for some staff to teach online. That will really be, the number of teachers that can do that will be dependent on the number of families that want to stay home. And so, but, you know, like I said earlier, we're following the guidelines that health experts have put in place to help ensure safety. And we do feel that if people are wearing personal protective equipment and they're washing their hands and they're keeping a safe distance, that we can be successful in school this year, and help ensure a safe environment. Can you hang on one second, Quinn? I gotta plug my computer in real quick.
No worries, happens to the best of us. I might move a little also.
I don't want to all of a sudden be gone.
No, it's okay. Good transition.
Hi everybody, it's ATMI senior producer Daisy Carter here. We wanted to take a moment to shout out another Alaska youth organization that is doing amazing work during this very strange time in our lives. Mask Mission AK is a group of West Anchorage high school students who are organizing Alaskans in making homemade masks which they donate to areas in our community in need. So far, they have provided over 1,400 masks to various sites such as ANMC, Alaska Regional Hospital, Beans Cafe, Anchorage Health Department, USO J-Bear, Anchorage Fire Department, and more. Stay tuned for future episodes of Podcast in Place where we talk to two of the group's organizers. You can find out more about them on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Mask Mission AK. And be sure to follow the hashtag #AKYouthCombatCovid to see what other youth organizations are doing to help Alaska flatten the curve and keep us all safe. And now back to Quinn's interview with ASD Director Joe Zawodny.
So now I have some questions about the logistics of reopening. And I know we talked about this for a second, but what social distancing measures are going to be put in place, and what's going to happen in really crowded areas like lunchrooms and hallways?
Some of the things that we're doing, and I can really speak for the secondary level, middle and high schools, but so we're not, we'll have passing between classes, but students are not going to have lockers this year. We're going to really minimize the amount of time that students are in the hallway. The idea would be that students, between classes, they leave one class, they go to the next class, and they have a bit of a break. We are, with the medium-high model that we're starting in, we have half as many students in classrooms at a time, so we can really ensure that 6 feet of distance between students. So typically, in a high school or middle school classroom, you'd have, 15 or 16 tables that could, and each class holds about 30 to 32 students. In the medium-high risk model, we have, one student at every table. So we can really help ensure that 6 feet between students. In lunchrooms, we're going to break students up as much as we can, have half as many students at lunch tables, for instance, allow students to eat in different areas of the school where they might normally not, maybe eat with social distancing in hallways and things of that nature. So like you said, we don't have as many students packed into small spaces at a time. It's really going to take some getting used to for students. It's going to take our staff really encouraging students to keep that distance, kind of like we see it at playgrounds and in the community, right? Where you see, we have kids that they kind of forget that they need to be keeping that distance. And so the adults around are helping to manage that space. That's what our teachers are going to be doing for a while. I don't think it's going to take long for our schools to just get into the habit of keeping that distance. We are going to be, like I said earlier, we're requiring all students and staff to wear face shields or masks if they're able to do so medically. We know that some students and staff can't wear masks, and so we have other plans in place for that. The district has purchased thousands of hand sanitizer dispensers. so that pretty much anywhere you go in a building, you're going to be able to have hand sanitizer on hand. So we're trying to do everything we can, provide masks, and I hope that with those measures in place and consistently practiced, that we're not going to see the spread that we're worried might happen.
Will schools change their attendance policies or offer extended sick leave for staff?
Community-wide, what we know is that if a staff member suspects that they may have COVID, they're gonna, they'll stay home. Hopefully they'll take a test, and so we can determine whether that's the case or not. They'll self-quarantine, and that's going to be the same with students as well. We're really relying on the community to be very cognizant of how students are feeling, to make sure that if a student's not feeling well that day, even if it's just a cold, that they stay home, because we don't want to put folks into a risky situation. And so we know that teachers want to be at school. We know students want to be at school, and we know that a lot of teachers and students will go to school even when they are sick in a normal year. And so we're relying on the community as a whole to make sure that we're all being safe, so that the community as a whole is safe.
How will the Anchorage School District respond to potential coronavirus outbreaks in schools?
So the district's developing a process for determining whether a school can be open or not based on the number of students or staff that may be infected. And so, for instance, if we're in a low risk situation, which we are not right now, we're in a medium risk situation, but if we're in a low risk situation and one staff member or one student has tested positive for COVID, the school may stay open. We're still trying to really finalize the plan. What we're going to end up doing is using a matrix to determine whether a school needs to open or close. And so a school that has an outbreak, for instance, may be closed, whereas other schools may stay open. So it's going to be a site-by-site decision based on COVID levels. So if at a high school, if you have 2 or 3 kids that test positive for COVID and they were at school yesterday, school's going to be closed tomorrow. The school district's going to come in, they're going to make sure that they clean everything really well. They're going to give the school time to be cleaned. We're going to make sure folks stay home for a day and then can potentially come back. And so it really is going to depend on the rate of infection and spread within the community and within individual schools.
Is there a plan to test students for coronavirus or for contact tracing? I'm tripping over my words a lot, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And is there funding for that?
So the school district is not going to be testing students for COVID. If a student is suspected of having COVID, the school district's going to encourage the family to get the student tested. And if the family, for whatever reason, doesn't get the student tested, then the student will have to self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, while the students out there still have access to all of their courses online, so they'll still be able to keep up with their classwork like they would in any other school year if they were sick. But the school district does not have plans at this time to test students or staff. Our school nurses will do some contact tracing to determine whether or not, a student who is suspected to have COVID or tests positive for COVID, what other students may have come into contact with them throughout the day. And so there will be some of those processes taking place, yes.
What happens if a teacher or a student dies after contracting coronavirus at school?
Well, I think number one priority for the district would be to make sure that the students and staff have support for that. As you know, we have students and staff that pass away throughout the school year. It's really difficult for a school community to deal with that. And so one of the things that the district ensures in those situations is that there are counselors involved and other mental health professionals that can help students cope with those sorts of losses. Again, it's going to, as far as what the school itself would do, it really would be dependent on the situation. We know that some folks contract COVID, and after the illness, they tend to feel fine and go back to work. And sometimes that takes a week or two. Sometimes that could take months, right? And so it really would just depend on what the timeline was around that infection.
You said our schools have these mental health resources, but are they planning on expanding them as we continue to go through this really difficult time?
Sure. So the municipality and the district have devoted some funds to hire more healthcare or mental health professionals for our buildings. Some buildings are piloting a program this year where we're increasing mental health assistance in the schools. In addition to that, all of our schools have counselors. All of our schools, have support personnel in place. And so, across the district, we're not necessarily adding mental health professionals to every building, but we are, as a district, increasing those numbers. And then we have school psychologists and counselors that can be dispatched to help a school that has a need at any time. And so that will happen sometimes, like I was saying earlier, if a student or a staff member passes away during a school year, we'll often send some extra help to that building to help students and staff cope.
So you answered all the questions I have, but is there anything else you want to add? Because
so much is changing with COVID and what we know about it, and because so much is changing in the Anchorage community regarding spread and infection rates, we're really just the colloquialism we use is flying the plane as we're building it, right? So we're doing the best we can to react and to predict some of the issues that are going to come up, and I think we're doing a good job of that. What we wouldn't be where we were today if we didn't have families and community members that were patient with the process, because though we like to think we know all the answers and can predict what is going to happen on August 20th, the reality is we don't. And so we put out a survey at the beginning of the summer, and while the community's feedback was clear that no one believes that an online environment was the best for kids, one of the positive pieces of feedback we got was that the community was supportive of the amount of communication that we were putting out. And so our hope is that families and students will continue to read the emails and watch the videos that Dr. Bishop is putting out so they can stay apprised of what those changes look like. It's one of those, it's a balance, right? We want to be definitive about our decisions, but also not be wrong. It's been really hard because we want to be able to just tell people what they want to hear, which is what we want to hear too, which is everything is safe and we're good to go. We're just unable to do that. So we know that every couple weeks, we're going to have to kind of make a decision about the next 2 weeks. What do the next 2 weeks look like?
Well, I really appreciate your time, Joe.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Quinn.
That was ATMI senior producer Quinn White interviewing middle school director Joe Zawodny on July 21st. Almost a week after they talked, the Anchorage School District superintendent said that due to rising case numbers, schools will likely start with online classes when the semester begins on August 20th. You've been listening to Podcast in Place, Youth Stories from Quarantine from Alaska Teen Media Institute. Our show's theme music was composed by Devin Schreckengost, with additional music from myself, Kendrick Whiteman. Stay tuned for more stories from quarantine youth. You can find these stories at alaskateenmedia.org, where we have included resources for youth during quarantine as a part of the partnership with the State of Alaska Division of Behavioral Health. Many thanks to our supporters, including the United Way of Anchorage, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rasmuson Foundation through the Arts and Education Fund administered under contract by the Alaska State Council on the Arts, Thanks to our listeners who contribute to our programs and would help us leverage additional funds and grants. If you would like to help support Youth Voices in Anchorage and help keep our podcast going, you could donate to our organization by going to alaskateenmedia.org and clicking donate. Also on our website, you can learn more about what our organization does, listen to past episodes of our podcast, or find out how you too can get involved. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. For Alaska Teen Media Institute, I'm Kendrick Whiteman. Thanks for listening. Stay safe out there, and we'll get through this together.